Good evening. My name is Rob Tionks, and for this week's module, in terms of relationships between technology and society, I decided to talk about the cell phone. And as vast as it is for a topic, I'm going to try to highlight this within the time frame and also just highlight how it's been able to basically shape the way our society interacts and where the technology came from, the meaning ascribed to the technology by a social group in America, which would probably be my group, which I would say was pretty much always using this particular device, and also to identify how technology shapes the way people behave, the one conflict that happens with humans and technologies, like this interact and converge, and then lastly, the implications on the conflict on people's relationships with one another because of cell phones and how it affects social relationships and behavior. Now, as Hughes mentions it, he talks about how technical systems are not infinitely malleable, or basically in this situation, malleable in that it's not easily influenced. It's not something that is susceptible to us by all means. Rather, if technologies like the bike or automobile are not independent forces shaping history, they still can exercise a soft determinism once they're in place. By that, I believe that he means that it's like a chicken and the egg situation. It's kind of like a conundrum. You can't have one without the other. So in this case, we created the cell phone, but the cell phone didn't just become so great just because of us alone. I think we can see the potential it had back in its history. And speaking of its brief history, basically, the first cell phones were conceptualized in 1917 when World War I soldiers in Germany they were basically using a field telephone. And then in that era, it pioneered many technological, scientific, and societal innovations. So that's pretty much the very prehistoric version, if you will, of cell phones. And that's per a Washington Post article back in September 9th of 2014, The History of the Mobile Phone. Most people recognize the history of mobile phones by the very big, almost cordless phone-looking device that Martin Cooper came up with when he basically made the first public phone call made on a cell phone in April 3rd of 1973. And in 1984, we saw cars with telephones, and then in 1989, the eventual release of the Microtek personal telephone by Motorola. They've since advanced to devices like this, but of course in the 90s it had to kind of go through its growing pains, which looked like a big cell phone and eventually went to a kind of walkie-talkie looking phone. Then there was the tablet kind of phone. It looked kind of like a little typing device or a typewriter. And then Apple came up with the iPhone on January of 2007 by the late great Steve Jobs. It's been a great instrument in shaping technology in relationships. I think the one thing we can consider in terms of how it shaped our actions or how our actions shape the technology is that we realize that as people, we'd like to kind of take a current existing idea and enhance it so that not only does it look visually appealing, but it also can build upon the foundations that others have come up with. It's like in music. You hear a musician being influenced by classical composers like Beethoven, and they're able to somehow think of a pop song like Billy Joel with Beethoven, or even a band like the Four Seasons being influenced by Baroque music. So that in itself, the iPhone's kind of like that, and it's a great device where we're able to bridge the distance or gap in communication or distances rather with individuals or family members, friends who may not have the ways to talk to us right away. So I think that's a great advantage, and the meaning ascribed to the technology I chose by Americans is that it's almost like a social status item. You know, there's people who talk about the great debate between smartphones and iPhones. So, you know, I prefer Apples. They're easy to use and it's very compact. Now, to summarize my video here, basically, the technology that I've chosen and how it shapes the way we behave is that I think we can become a very concise, very instant type of individual when it comes to expressing our ideas, but it's very easy to forget that face-to-face interaction is very key and paramount in establishing and maintaining those relationships. We can't always rely on these because we'll forget about the human element involved. And that's basically the conflict that we run into. And the implication as a result of cell phones is that we rely on short, instant communication. And then we forget about being somewhere between detailed and concise. We have to remember that as people, not everyone's going to get our ideas right away. So we can't just talk like in shorthand form in texts to others. We have to remember that how I may communicate to others may be understood to a certain sense, but not another demographic is going to understand my conceptualizations or my frame of thought if I'm just going to talk in shorthand. So cell phones are great. They've got video cameras, they've got video games, you can do conferences with your colleagues, make phone calls right away, but ultimately, isn't what living's all about just being able to interact with people? So, it's no slight to classes like this, because online classes are great, but ultimately, we have to remember that as much time as we spend around a computer or a cell phone, it's good to be a part of real life. So, those are my thoughts with this week's module, and I hope you got to enjoy my thoughts. I'll try to keep it a little shorter next time, but thanks for tuning in, I suppose, and I'll see you next time.